books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are two separate books in our modern Bibles, but they were originally written as one coherent story. The book of Judges demonstrated Israel's need for a king. 1 Samuel provides an answer to that problem through the establishment of the monarchy, the kings in Israel. Moving into today, 2 Samuel then records King David's reign over Israel. This book traces David's ascent to the throne as well as his descent into sin, such as adultery and murder. And we'll see that following these awful sins are awful consequences for both David's family and the entire nation of Israel. Something of the consequences and destructive nature of sin, which has its same effect in our lives today. Main idea: despite David's sin, God remained faithful to his plan of salvation. And there's encouragement for that for us, and that God hates sin and he deals with sin rightly, but he will not forget your salvation accomplished by faith in Jesus. Encouragement for each and every one of us who are far from perfect people, sinning, making mistakes every single day. Despite David's sin, God here through 2 Samuel remained faithful to his covenant to David, his plan of salvation for all the nations, starting through David and Israel. Here you see a few key themes for the night: success and blessing, verses 1 through 10. You see David's rise to king and great success at the start. Chapters 11 through 20 highlight sin and its consequences in David's life, but the book thankfully concludes with some future hope for us all. Starting at the beginning of the book here, 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 1, we get the death of Saul. We finished 1 Samuel last week in Saul's death. Well, here at the start of this book, we get the news of Saul's death reaching David. I want you to see this and David's amazing response. Remember, Saul was seeking to kill David all throughout the 1 Samuel narrative. And here we see David's amazing response to hearing of Saul, his enemy's death. Verse 1 begins, "After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, 'Where do you come from?' He said, 'I have escaped from the camp of Israel.' And David said, 'How did it go? Tell me.' You can see the eagerness in David's voice there. Then the man answered, 'The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead.'" So that's King Saul, it's past, and that's Jonathan, one of Saul's sons, and David's best friend, as a matter of fact. Look at David's response. I'm going to summarize for you here. This man who reached David and gave him the news then tells David that he killed Saul. Saul was injured after battle, near death, and the man says, "Saul asked me to kill him." And it needed to happen because he was not going to have much of a life after those casualties. David then responds by avenging Saul's death and killing this man. David says, "How could you at any point kill the king?" So he kills the man, avenging Saul's death. And you see verses 17 through the end of chapter 1, David's mourning and lamenting for the death of King Saul and his son Jonathan. Verse 27 concludes, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished." I think it's an amazing response by David. A lot of people would be very happy that this person who's trying to kill you has died, but David is mourning and lamenting the passing of Saul. It is at this point we know from 1 Samuel, David was already anointed by God to become king of Israel. This was a plan that could not be stopped. Soon after Saul's death, David is anointed as king of Judah, smaller portion of Israel, not yet the king because Ish Ishbosheth, verse 8 in chapter 2, is crowned king of Israel. And this man, who is son of Saul, continues Saul's crusade to kill David. Read all throughout 1 Samuel. What we see is that David survives. Ishbosheth in chapter 4 is murdered. He passes away. And then chapter 5, David is anointed the king of Israel. David starts off on the right foot, defeating the Philistines in chapter 5. He unified Israel, bringing them together after all of the civil war type living. In chapter 6, David then calls for the Ark of the Covenant to be brought into Jerusalem. We talked in the past few weeks, the Ark of the Covenant is what the Ten Commandments were housed in, contained, where they held the Ten Commandments. They were even symbolic of the presence of God. So this is David inquiring of the Lord, wanting the Lord's presence to be within his midst and within Jerusalem. He brings the Ark of the Covenant back, and he inquires of the Lord at this point, chapters 6 and 7, Lord, should we build a big house, a big temple to put the Ark of the Covenant in so that your presence can dwell among our people? This is remarkable in and of itself. We'll read through the kings in the next couple weeks and see that the vast majority of the kings have no care for the Lord, no prayer, no inquiry of what he may want. So that's David's request, or his ask of the Lord in prayer. Here's God's response in chapter 7. We get the Davidic covenant. God responds to David's question, verse 5 of chapter 7. Would you build me a house to dwell in? Skip down and continue his response. He says, verse 8, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, being a shepherd boy, that you should be prince and king over my people. Verse 9, I have been with you wherever you went, and had cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And verse 10, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. Here in the Lord's covenant with David, what God is saying is, I have brought you to where you are today. I don't need you to build me a temple for my presence. I am here, and you need me. So in the covenants we've talked about, the past studies through the books of the Bible, it's a binding agreement, a contract between two parties. Covenant between God and Israel is, I will be your God and protect you and provide for you if you will be my people of faith following me. God specifically starts covenants with leaders of Israel. You have the Abrahamic covenant, which we'll see Sunday morning, and here the Davidic covenant. And here's what his covenant says to David, verse 12. Here's God's promise to David. Verse 12 of chapter 7, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So God's covenant with David, his promise is that you will be a king and you will be great, but after you there will be an offspring, a son in your family lineage, of whom will be king of all people and king forever. There's immediate, short-term fulfillment to that, and then an eternal fulfillment that we will reference in just a few minutes at the end of our study. So there's the Davidic covenant. Chapters 8 through 10, then David continues to ride the high horse and victories and great things as king until chapter 11. You get the story of David and Bathsheba. Now, I was going to go through this story tonight. I think I'm going to pass over it. You all are familiar with the story. Here's the point I want to make. We all know what happens here. David has an affair with Bathsheba and then sends Uriah out to be murdered to cover up his sin, right? There's a story in a short little sentence. What I want you to see is what very likely led to this sin for David. Look at chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him. Key words, in the spring of the year, when kings go out to battle, David sent other people in his place. What David is experiencing here is a time of great victory, and he's relaxed. He's sat back in comfort and sent his generals out to battle, and he stayed home. End of verse 2, look at that. End of verse 1, rather, it says, "But David remained at Jerusalem." So what we should be leery of here in our lives, looking at David, I think one of many things we should be leery of are the good times, when all seems to be going well, when we've let down our defenses. And one way to keep from letting this happen in our lives is in the good and the bad, to fight the good fight of the faith, to seek and pursue the Lord, to know Him, to make Him known, and to do this together as individuals on that level, as a church, and as families. And this keeps our focus on God and mission and away from neglect and comfort. Here you see David, great, mighty king. He's no longer going to go out and fight the fights with his people, but when the kings usually go out to battle, he sent Joab, and he remained in Jerusalem. And I think there may even be some humor or sarcasm in verse 2. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch. What's he doing on the couch late one afternoon? It's like he slept in. He's grown super comfortable, and we know the rest of this story. He rises from his couch and sees a bathing, beautiful Bathsheba and commits sin, adultery, and murders her husband. David lets Bathsheba mourn for some time and then brings her into his home with apparently the sin covered up, and marries her along with his other wives. Verse 12, chapter 12, if you'll flip it, shows Nathan calling out David's sin. I love this short story. I'm going to read these first few verses if you'll follow. Nathan uses an illustration of a poor man and a rich man to call out David's sin. David has brushed it under the rug and acts like all is okay. The Lord sent Nathan to David, verse 1. He came to him and said to him, "There were two men in a certain city. There was a rich man and a poor man. The rich man had many flocks and many herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little lamb." The story continues to say the rich man had a guest come into his house, but rather than pull from his many herds, flocks of lambs to feed the guest, he took the one lamb from the poor man, slaughtered it, and killed his guest. He didn't kill his guest, right? He fed his guest with the one lamb. David, look at David's response, verse 5. He hears this story. David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die." Look at Nathan's response. He uses a great illustration here. And then he said to David, verse 7, "You are that man who is taken from the poor and act like you are high and mighty and righteous." So terrible sin. He calls him out. And one thing is clear. Though it's all awful, adultery and murder, David is thankfully repentant. But that doesn't clear the consequences for his sin. We're going to brush through these final chapters really quick. I want to point out the consequences for David's sin. Look at the turmoil it causes he, his family, and all of the nation of Israel. Again, sin is never worth it. Chapter 12, verse 16 begins with the story of David's child dying. There is a glimmer of hope here at the end of chapter 12 of Solomon's birth. We'll talk about Solomon in a minute. But the consequences continue there through the rest of 2 Samuel. You have the story of Amnon and Tamar. Tamar is David's daughter. Amnon is David's son. David's son tries to take advantage of his own sister and have relations with her. She turns him away and gets away from him. But then another brother, Absalom, really does not like that this happened. It angers him, and rightfully so. But Absalom then kills his brother, getting revenge for him trying to take advantage of his sister. So this is all happening within David's home. Absalom then, who killed his brother, starts a conspiracy and raises up a following within Israel, who then start to chant that he is king. This rises to the level of David, chapter 15, having to flee Jerusalem. Again, Absalom has taken over, similar to what happened with Saul, and he's seeking to kill and take David's life. The king of Israel went to adultery and murder and sin, and his family has not only fallen apart, but is coming at his own life and taking over his throne. King David has fled Jerusalem for his life. Story continues through of Absalom's rebellion. Long story short, Absalom in chapter 18 is killed, and thankfully David returns to Jerusalem in 2 Samuel chapter 19. Here you have a sad and somber David who has lost seemingly everything, family and the righteous ruling of Israel, yet back on his throne. The final 4 chapters show a glimmer of future hope. We'll close here. Chapters 21 through 24. These final chapters are kind of couched, bookended by stories of the failures of Saul and David. You see some of those in chapters 21 and chapter 24. And this is pointing out the fact that Saul and David are not perfect. They are men and they are sinful. But in the middle of these final 4 chapters, chapters 22 and 23, David concludes the book of 2 Samuel with 2 poems. You see the first of those poems, David's Song of Deliverance in chapter 22, and the last words of David beginning in chapter 23. These poems point towards the faithfulness of God and a future coming king. In David's 2 poems, he remembers times when God graciously rescued him from danger. He probably would have reminisced on the story of David and Goliath, on God rescuing him from Saul's hand who was coming at him, on God bringing him up to be king. David saw these moments as God being faithful to his covenant promise to David and his family. What we see, though, is that both of these poems, each of these poems, chapter 22 and 23, look back to God's promise. Remember the Davidic covenant in chapter 7 of a future king. David reflects the end of his poem on God's promise. This future king who will build the eternal kingdom of God, who will be king forever with no end, who will bring salvation to all nations and all peoples. There you have the book of Samuel, as crazy as it sounds, ending with the glimmer of future hope. I noted the prophecies and prophetic covenants such as this usually always have an immediate fulfillment and an eternal fulfillment. The immediate we see, continuing to read through the Bible, is in King Solomon, son of David, born from Bathsheba. And that's remarkable in and of itself. David was an adulterer who went to Bathsheba in terrible fashion. God takes great evil and turns it to great good, as King Solomon being that immediate fulfillment who will bring great days to God's people Israel. Though the eternal fulfillment we know to be King Jesus, who likewise, yet much later, came from the family line of King David, and who sits on his throne and reigns to this day God's people. So there you have the main idea of really the entire Samuel narrative, that despite even Saul and David's sin and evil, God remains unwaveringly faithful to his plan of salvation for his people. So that's the book of 2 Samuel. We'll pray the word now together.